Late winter of 1873 hit the upper Great Lakes wilderness hard. The woodsman learned this when ice formed inside his cabin walls and his water bucket froze solid 3 feet from his wood stove. He had built his cabin exactly like every settler in the Minnesota borderlands was told to. Stacked logs with clay daub packed in every gap, standard frontier method. By spring, he had burned more firewood than 2 families should need, and still the cold cut through those walls. Across the settlement, homesteaders fought the same losing battle in cabins built by the book and failing by the season. Over the next winter, the woodsman quietly applied an old technique his ancestors had used, and his cabin stayed 32 degrees warmer than his neighbors while using half the wood. What did he understand about sealing log cabins that every other frontier builder was missing? The settlement sat in a natural clearing where loggers had stripped the largest white pine 15 years earlier, leaving stumps scattered between second-growth spruce and tamarack. 7 families had claimed plots that autumn of 1872, mostly former lumber camp workers and farmers seeking cheaper land after the panic back east. They had 4 months to raise cabins before the hard freeze, and every man followed the same trusted method passed down through lumber camps and frontier guides. The standard technique seemed straightforward enough. Stack your logs using saddle notch or butt and pass corners, then gather clay from the riverbank or swampy flats about a quarter-mile downstream. Mix the clay with water until it held together like thick porridge, then work in whatever you could find to give it body: dried grass, animal hair saved from butchering, or sand if the clay ran too thin. Pack this daub into every gap between logs using a wooden paddle or your hands. Smooth it off and let it dry hard before winter arrived. The method cost nothing but labor, required no special tools, and had served frontier families from Pennsylvania to the Dakota Territory. But clay daub had never been tested against the particular conditions of that border country winter. The temperature swung 40 degrees in a single day, from just above freezing to 20 below, then back up when Chinook winds pushed through. Logs that had seemed tight in autumn began to shift and settle as the wood dried in the cabin heat. The clay, hard as stone when it cured, had no give to it. When the logs moved, the daub cracked along the stress lines. Thomas Henley, the woodsman's nearest neighbor to the south, discovered the problem first. His cabin had seemed solid through December, but by mid-January, he was waking to find snow blown through hairline cracks onto his sleeping furs. The gaps widened each night as the logs contracted in the cold, and the rigid clay simply split apart rather than moving with the wood. By late January, Henley could hold a candle near his wall and watch the flame, dance in the draft coming through gaps wide enough to slide a knife blade through. The Nordahl family to the east suffered worse. Their clay daub had been mixed too thin that fall, and whole chunks began falling away during the first severe freeze in early February. Anna Nordahl spent hours each day stuffing rags and pieces of bark into the gaps to keep the wind out, but their newborn daughter developed a cough that rattled her tiny chest through the coldest weeks. The baby survived, but just barely, and only because Anna never let the fire die completely, burning through their winter wood supply at twice the expected rate. The worst failure struck the Miller cabin on the north side of the clearing. Heinrich Miller had followed the method exactly, but his clay came from a deposit with too much sand in it. The daub dried hard enough, but it lacked cohesion. When the freeze-thaw cycle began in March, whole sections crumbled away like old mortar, leaving gaps the size of a man's fist. Mice poured through these openings and destroyed half his stored corn before he could trap them all. Muller spent 3 days in April tearing out all the old daub and starting over, this time mixing in hair from his draft horse to give the clay more binding strength. The woodsman watched these failures with growing certainty that his neighbors were fighting against the nature of wood instead of working with it. His name was Eric Larson, son of Norwegian immigrants who had settled first in Wisconsin before moving north to trap beaver and marten in the deep woods. His father had told him stories of log houses back in the old country, built to last generations in climates colder than anything Minnesota offered. The Norwegian method used moss, not clay, packed thick between logs that were carefully scribed to fit tight from the start. Eric had dismissed those stories as old world nonsense when he first started building cabins for the logging company. Clay daub worked well enough for bunkhouses that only needed to last a season or two, but permanent cabins demanded different thinking. In late February, while his neighbors struggled with their failing walls, he walked to the tamarack bog a half-mile beyond the settlement and began gathering wet sphagnum moss by the armload. The moss grew thick along the bog edges, pale green and spongy, soaked with snowmelt and spring water. Eric pulled it up in dense mats, shaking off the excess water but leaving it damp. Back at his cabin, he began working the moss into the gaps between his logs using a wooden wedge whittled from birch. The wet moss compressed easily under pressure, filling every irregular space between the log surfaces. As it dried over the following days, the moss expanded slightly, creating a tight seal that flexed with the wood's movement. Heinrich Miller watched this process with unconcealed skepticism. "You are wasting your time with that swamp grass," he told Eric one morning as he passed the cabin site. "Moss will rot by summer and leave you worse off than before. Pack out from frost, too. Mice will nest in it. Better to stick with good clay like sensible people." Others in the settlement shared Muller's doubts. Thomas Henley called it Norski foolishness and predicted the moss would shrink to nothing once it dried, leaving gaps wider than before. Even Anna Nordahl, whose own cabin had nearly cost her child's life, shook her head when she saw Eric packing the green moss into his walls. "In Pennsylvania, we always used clay," she said. "My father built 3 cabins that way, and they stood firm." But Eric remembered his grandfather's hands working moss into the gaps of their Wisconsin cabin when he was 7 years old, and how that cabin had stayed warm through winters that killed cattle. The old man had explained that moss was alive, that it moved and breathed with the wood, never fighting against the natural settling and shifting that all timber did. Clay fought the wood and lost. Moss worked with it and endured. The test would come with the next hard freeze, when the logs contracted one final time before spring arrived for good. The final test came during the second week of March 1873, when a Canadian air mass settled over the region and held temperatures below zero for 8 straight days. Eric's moss-packed walls faced their first serious challenge, while his neighbors struggled through another round of emergency repairs to their cracking clay daub. On the coldest night, when the mercury dropped to 10 degrees below zero, Eric stoked his small sheet iron stove twice after supper, then let the fire die to coals. By morning, his cabin interior held steady at 45 degrees, while Thomas Henley's cabin, just 200 yards away, had dropped to 33 degrees, despite Henley feeding his stove 3 times during the night. The difference lay not just in the chinking material, but in how completely the moss sealed every irregular gap where logs met. Sphagnum moss possessed qualities that clay could never match. When Eric had packed it wet between his logs, the moss compressed under the pressure of his wooden wedge, squeezing into every crack and crevice. As winter air dried it out, the moss expanded slightly, creating pressure against the log surfaces that held it firmly in place. Unlike clay that hardened into a brittle shell, the dried moss remained springy and flexible. When logs contracted in the cold, the moss compressed without breaking. When they expanded in warmer weather, the moss had enough give to accommodate the movement without losing its seal. The superior performance became measurable during that March cold snap. Eric burned through just 3/4 of a cord of split maple during the 8-day freeze, keeping his cabin comfortable for himself and his wife Astrid. Meanwhile, Henley consumed nearly 2 full cords, trying to maintain barely tolerable temperatures. The Muller cabin, still plagued by gaps in their hastily repaired clay daub, burned through 2.5 cords while Heinrich and his family huddled close to their stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned. But moss alone did not account for all the improvements Eric achieved that winter. His grandfather's stories had included other Nordic techniques for sealing the gaps that standard log notching left behind. Around his door frame and the single window opening, Eric applied a mixture of oakum and pine pitch that he learned from Knut Pedersen, an elderly Norwegian who had helped Eric's father build their Wisconsin cabin years earlier. Oakum came from unraveling old rope, teasing the hemp fibers loose until they formed a soft, stringy mass. Mixed with pine pitch heated until it flowed like thick honey, the oakum created a flexible caulk that could be worked into joints and corners where two different materials met. Eric gathered pitch from white pine trees by scoring the bark in spring and collecting the golden resin that seeped out. Heated in an iron pot until it melted, then mixed with the loose hemp fibers, it formed a compound that stayed pliable even in cold weather while providing a complete air seal. This technique addressed problems that moss chinking could not solve. Where his door frame met the log wall, irregular gaps remained despite careful fitting. Standard frontier practice called for stuffing these spaces with clay or rags, but both methods failed when wood movement opened new cracks. The oakum and pitch mixture compressed into these gaps and moved with the wood, maintaining the seal through temperature changes that would crack rigid materials. The contrast with conventional methods became stark during a particularly brutal night when the temperature dropped to 5 below zero, with a northwest wind that drove snow horizontally across the clearing. Eric and Astrid slept comfortably under a single wool blanket, while their neighbor Anna Nordahl sat up all night feeding their fire, wrapped in 3 blankets with their baby tucked inside her coat for warmth. The Nordahl cabin, despite multiple attempts to patch their failing daub, leaked cold air through dozens of small gaps that no amount of clay seemed able to seal permanently. That same night revealed another advantage of Eric's methods. Small gaps in the neighbor's walls allowed not just cold air to enter, but also provided highways for mice and other small creatures seeking warmth and food. The Moseller cabin suffered a fresh invasion of field mice that night, the creatures squeezing through cracks in the clay daub to reach their stored grain. Heinrich spent the next morning setting traps and trying to plug new holes with fresh clay that would likely crack again before spring arrived. Eric's cabin showed no signs of rodent intrusion. The moss, chinking, packed tight and expanding as it dried, left no passages large enough for even the smallest mouse. The oakum and pitch around openings created seamless barriers that creatures could neither bite through nor squeeze past. By spring, when other families in the settlement had lost significant portions of their stored food to rodents and spoilage, Eric and Astrid's supplies remained intact and pest-free. The knowledge behind these techniques reached back through generations of Scandinavian builders who had learned to work with wood and weather rather than against them. Knut Pedersen remembered his own grandfather in Norway using moss and pitch to seal log houses that sheltered families for decades without major repairs. The principle was simple. Materials that moved with the wood lasted longer than materials that fought against natural expansion and contraction. But Eric also drew lessons from indigenous builders he had encountered during his trapping years. Ojibwe families in the deep woods constructed winter lodges using flexible birch bark and moss insulation that lasted through harsh seasons without the constant maintenance that rigid materials required. They understood that living materials like moss and bark possessed qualities that manufactured or processed materials could not match. By April, when the worst of winter had passed, Eric's cabin had proven the value of traditional methods over frontier shortcuts. While his neighbors planned extensive repairs to their failing daub, Eric's walls remained tight and secure, requiring no maintenance beyond a small amount of fresh oakum around his doorframe, where daily use had compressed the original seal. Spring of 1874 brought new challenges that exposed another weakness in conventional frontier building. Eric's neighbors had focused entirely on sealing their walls, but they had built their cabins directly on packed earth floors that turned their living spaces into cold sinks during the long winter months. Even when their stoves burned hot, the dirt floors remained frozen solid, drawing heat downward and creating perpetual dampness that chilled the air near ground level. Eric recognized this problem from his logging camp days, where bunkhouses built on dirt floors stayed miserable even with large barrel stoves burning around the clock. The earth beneath the cabin acted like a massive heat drain, absorbing warmth from the interior and conducting it deep into the frozen ground. Men sleeping on the floor often woke with frost on their blankets, while the air 6 feet above them felt almost comfortable. The solution lay in breaking that direct connection between the living space and the frozen earth below. Eric spent 2 weeks that September splitting logs lengthwise to create puncheon planks, each one hewn flat on the upper surface and roughly 12 inches wide. These split logs, laid flat side up across foundation logs, created a raised wooden floor that stood 8 inches above the ground. But Eric added a crucial element that distinguished his approach from simple plank flooring. Before laying his puncheons, Eric gathered armloads of fresh-cut spruce boughs and spread them in a thick layer across the entire floor area. Over these green branches, he scattered several inches of pine needles, creating a springy bed of organic material beneath his wooden floor. This technique came from Enumke, an Ojibwe guide Eric had worked with during his trapping years, who had shown him how forest-dwelling people insulated their winter shelters using layers of evergreen boughs that trapped air while remaining relatively dry. The bough bed served multiple purposes that dirt floors could never match. The springy branches created countless air pockets that prevented ground cold from conducting upward through the wooden planks. Pine needles filled smaller gaps between the boughs, adding another layer of insulation while their natural oils provided some protection against insects and decay. Most importantly, the organic bed remained flexible, compressing under the weight of the floor planks without creating rigid connections that would conduct cold. Eric's floor stayed noticeably warmer than his neighbors' dirt surfaces throughout the winter. While frost formed regularly on the packed earth in other cabins, Eric's puncheon floor remained above freezing even during the coldest nights. The temperature difference measured roughly 10 degrees, enough to prevent the bone-deep chill that made other settlers reluctant to walk barefoot in their own homes. But Eric's most significant innovation involved the thermal mass system he built around his heating stove. Standard frontier practice called for placing a sheet iron stove on a simple stone pad to protect the wooden floor, then connecting it to a basic chimney that carried heat and smoke outside as quickly as possible. This approach wasted enormous amounts of energy, sending most of the heat generated by burning wood straight up the chimney and out of the cabin. Eric constructed his heating system differently, drawing on knowledge passed down through German immigrant families who had built massive masonry stoves in Pennsylvania. He surrounded his sheet iron stove with a carefully designed stone and clay assembly that captured and stored heat, rather than allowing it to escape immediately. Large field stones, each one weighing 40 to 60 pounds, formed the base and back wall of his stove platform. Above and around the stove, Eric built up layers of flat stones mortared together with clay mixed with sand for strength. The key element was a thermal mass bench that extended 3 feet out from the stove on one side, built from stones and packed clay that formed a solid mass weighing several hundred pounds. This bench stood 18 inches high and provided seating during the day, but its real purpose became apparent during cold nights. The massive stone and clay construction absorbed heat from the stove fire, storing thermal energy in its dense materials. After Eric banked his fire each evening, the thermal mass continued radiating, warmth for hours into the night. The heavy stones and clay held heat like a giant battery, releasing it slowly and steadily, long after the fire had died to coals. On nights when the outdoor temperature dropped below zero, Eric's cabin maintained comfortable warmth until morning, while his neighbors woke to find their cabins nearly as cold as the outside air. The contrast became dramatic during a February cold snap that lasted 5 days. Eric stoked his stove each morning and evening, allowing the fire to burn down to coals between feedings. His thermal mass bench remained warm to the touch throughout each night, keeping the cabin interior at 48 degrees when outside temperatures held steady at 15 below zero. Heinrich Müller, burning wood almost continuously in his simple sheet iron stove, could barely maintain 35 degrees in his cabin, despite using twice as much fuel. Thomas Henley attempted to copy Eric's approach by piling stones around his own stove, but without understanding the principles involved, his makeshift thermal mass provided little benefit. Henley had used stones that were too small and had not built them into a unified mass that could absorb and hold heat effectively. His loose pile of rocks absorbed some heat during burning, but released it too quickly to provide overnight warmth. The thermal mass system also improved safety and convenience in ways that standard stove installations could not match. Eric's heavy stone construction eliminated the risk of his stove tipping over or shifting during use, while the broad stone platform protected his wooden floor from sparks and embers. The bench provided comfortable seating near the warmest part of the cabin, and its retained heat meant that Eric could restart his fire each morning without the bitter cold that made other settlers reluctant to leave their beds. By spring, Eric's integrated system of moss-chinked walls, insulated flooring, and thermal mass heating had proven its effectiveness through a winter that tested every aspect of frontier construction. While his neighbors planned major modifications to their failing cabins, Eric's innovations had created a living space that remained comfortable, efficient, and reliable through the harshest conditions the northern wilderness could deliver. 2 seasons of harsh weather had proven Eric's methods superior to conventional frontier building, but the real test came with the long-term challenges that destroyed most cabins within 5 years. Wood was a living material that continued moving long after trees were cut and notched into walls. Logs shrank as they dried, settled as they bore weight, and twisted as internal stresses released over months and years. Most settlers built their cabins as if wood were stone, expecting it to stay exactly where they placed it, then wondered why their structures failed when the timber did what timber always did. Eric understood this fundamental principle from his years working with Norwegian shipbuilders in the lumber camps along Lake Superior. Boat builders knew that wood moved with weather and time, so they chose their timber carefully and joined it with techniques that accommodated natural changes rather than fighting them. A ship built to resist wood movement would break apart in the first heavy seas, but vessels built to flex with the stresses could sail for decades through storms that would sink rigid craft. The first crucial decision involved selecting the right species for different parts of the structure. Eric had built his walls using spruce and tamarack logs, but not randomly chosen pieces. He spent 3 weeks that first autumn walking through the forest, examining individual trees and marking those with the qualities he needed. Straight-grained spruce with minimal taper made the best wall logs because they dried evenly without excessive twisting. Tamarack, naturally resistant to rot, went into the bottom courses where ground moisture posed the greatest threat. Most importantly, Eric stripped the bark from every log before building, then let the timber season for 6 weeks before construction. His neighbors had used green logs with bark still attached, following the common belief that bark helped seal the wood and prevented cracking. But bark trapped moisture against the wood surface, creating ideal conditions for rot and insect damage. Worse, logs with bark dried unevenly, the protected wood underneath shrinking at different rates than the exposed ends, creating warping and checking that opened gaps no amount of chinking could seal permanently. Eric's seasoned, bark-free logs dried uniformly and predictably. When they shrank, they did so evenly, maintaining their shape while settling into tighter joints. The 6-week seasoning period removed much of the moisture that caused the most dramatic movement, so his finished walls moved less than his neighbor's green timber construction. The notching technique made an even greater difference in long-term stability. Standard frontier practice used simple saddle notches chopped with an axe, creating joints that fit roughly but left gaps and contact points that shifted as the wood dried. Eric employed the scribe-fit method taught by Scandinavian craftsmen, using a compass made from 2 pointed sticks to trace the exact contour of each log onto the one below it. He then carved the notch to match this precise outline, creating joints where the logs contacted along their entire curved surfaces, rather than just at a few high points. This technique required more skill and time than rough axe work, but the results lasted decades longer. When scribe-fitted logs settled, they pressed more tightly together instead of creating new gaps. The increased contact area distributed weight evenly, preventing the point loading that caused logs to crush and shift in poorly fitted joints. Eric's corners remained tight and square through multiple seasons of expansion and contraction that loosened conventional notching. But the most critical innovation involved protecting the entire structure from moisture damage that destroyed most frontier cabins within a decade. Eric extended his roof beyond the walls by 3 feet on all sides, creating deep eaves that threw rainwater well clear of the log walls. This overhang required longer roof timbers and more complex construction, but it prevented the saturation cycles that rotted wall logs from the outside. Standard cabin roofs barely extended past the walls, directing water down the exterior log surfaces during every rainstorm. Over time, this constant wetting and drying caused the outer surface of wall logs to check and crack, creating pathways for moisture to penetrate deep into the wood. Once water reached the interior of a log, Rot fungi found ideal growing conditions in the damp wood protected from drying air circulation. Eric's extended roof kept his walls dry during all but the most severe windstorms. The 3-foot overhang cast a shadow zone around the cabin perimeter, where his logs remained protected from direct precipitation. This simple modification eliminated the primary cause of log rot in frontier construction, extending the life of his cabin by decades compared to structures that absorbed moisture with every rain. Ground-level moisture protection required different techniques that Eric learned from observing how indigenous builders kept their structures dry. Around the base of his cabin, Eric built a protective skirt using stones and split logs that raised the foundation timbers 8 inches above the surrounding soil level. This elevation kept the bottom logs clear of standing water during spring snowmelt and heavy rains that turned the forest floor into a swamp. More importantly, Eric dug a shallow drainage ditch around the entire cabin perimeter, sloping it to carry runoff away from the foundation toward a natural low spot 50 yards downhill. This ditch, only 6 inches deep but carefully graded, prevented water from pooling around the cabin base, where it could soak into the lower logs and create rot conditions that would eventually compromise the entire structure. The combination of elevated foundation, drainage system, and protective roof overhang created a moisture management system that kept Eric's cabin dry while his neighbors struggled with water damage year after year. Heinrich Muller discovered rot in his bottom logs during the 3rd spring, requiring him to jack up one entire wall and replace 2 foundation timbers that had become soft with decay. Thomas Henley battled recurring problems with moisture-damaged chinking that had to be repaired each fall when rain-soaked clay daub crumbled away from his walls. By the end of 1876, 3 full years after construction, Eric's cabin showed minimal signs of weathering while his neighbors dealt with ongoing structural problems that demanded constant attention and repair. His careful attention to wood selection, precise joinery, and moisture protection had created a building that worked with natural forces rather than against them, proving that traditional techniques based on understanding materials could outperform conventional methods that ignored the fundamental properties of wood and weather. The winter of 1876 arrived early and stayed late, bringing conditions that would become legendary throughout the Northern Territories. By December, temperatures had already dropped below 20 degrees below zero, and January brought sustained cold that pushed the mercury down to 40 below for days at a time. The final test came during the first week of February, when a massive Arctic air mass settled over the region and held temperatures at 50 degrees below zero for 6 consecutive days and nights. This unprecedented cold exposed every weakness in frontier construction methods, while providing the ultimate vindication of Eric's integrated building system. Conventional cabins became barely habitable ice houses where families huddled around constantly burning stoves, consuming enormous quantities of firewood while still struggling to survive the brutal conditions. The Nordahl cabin suffered the worst, with interior temperatures dropping to 15 degrees above zero, despite Anna feeding their stove every 2 hours around the clock. Eric's cabin faced the same merciless cold, but responded entirely differently. His thermal mass system proved its greatest value during this extreme period, the massive stone and clay construction storing enough heat from evening fires to maintain interior warmth through the long sub-zero nights. While his neighbors burned through their winter wood supplies at catastrophic rates, Eric stoked his stove just twice daily, morning and evening, yet maintained interior temperatures between 45 and 50 degrees throughout the entire cold snap. The fuel consumption difference became starkly measurable. During that 6-day deep freeze, Eric burned through exactly 1 1/4 cords of split maple, while Thomas Henley consumed nearly 4 cords trying to keep his family alive in their poorly sealed cabin. Heinrich Müller exhausted his entire remaining wood supply and had to venture out in dangerous cold to cut green timber that burned poorly and produced little heat. But Eric had also developed techniques for managing the unique challenges that extreme cold created inside even well-sealed cabins. Most settlers ignored the problem of moisture buildup that occurred when warm air from cooking and breathing met frigid walls and windows. This condensation froze into thick ice layers on interior surfaces, creating additional cold sources that drained heat from the living space. Eric addressed this issue through careful ventilation management that balanced fresh air circulation with heat retention. Near the peak of his roof, Eric had installed a small wooden vent that could be opened or closed from inside the cabin using a cord and pulley system. During normal winter weather, he kept this vent mostly closed to retain heat. But during extreme cold periods when moisture buildup became severe, he opened the vent slightly for brief periods each day, allowing humid interior air to escape while drawing in small amounts of fresh outside air that, though brutally cold, carried no moisture to condense on his walls. This controlled ventilation prevented the ice buildup that plagued other cabins, where thick frost on walls and windows actually made interior conditions colder by creating additional cold surfaces. Eric's walls remained relatively dry and free of ice, allowing his thermal mass system to work at full efficiency without competing against internal cold sources created by frozen condensation. The extreme cold also tested food preservation systems that most settlers had never considered carefully. Standard frontier practice stored food supplies in root cellars or simple storage areas that relied on earth temperature for preservation. But during the 50 below cold snap, even underground storage spaces froze solid, ruining root vegetables and preserved meats that families depended on for winter survival. Eric had built his food storage into an interior corner of his cabin, taking advantage of heat spillover from his thermal mass system. He constructed wooden storage boxes lined with moss and bark that maintained temperatures just above freezing even during the worst cold. His dried meat, stored corn, and root vegetables remained edible throughout the crisis, while his neighbors watched their food supplies freeze and spoil, creating potential starvation conditions. The spring that followed revealed the full scope of damage that conventional construction methods had suffered during the winter's assault. Heinrich Müller discovered extensive rot in 3 of his foundation logs, damage that had accelerated rapidly when moisture trapped in poorly sealed joints froze and expanded, splitting the wood fibers and creating pathways for decay organisms. Thomas Henley found similar damage plus extensive chinking failure that left his cabin requiring complete reconstruction of 2 walls. Most devastating for the settlement's future, the Nordahl family made the decision to abandon their homestead entirely. The combination of structural damage, depleted wood supplies, and the near loss of their second child to cold-related illness convinced them that the location was simply too harsh for successful settlement using conventional methods. Their departure reduced the community by 1/4 and discouraged other potential settlers who heard stories of the brutal winter. Eric's cabin, by contrast, emerged from the winter trial stronger than before. His scribe-fitted logs had settled more tightly together under the extreme temperature cycling. His moss chinking showed no deterioration and required no repairs. His food supplies remained adequate, and his fuel consumption had been so efficient that he retained enough firewood to last through a normal spring without cutting additional timber. Word of Eric's success began attracting visitors from other frontier settlements facing similar challenges. During the spring of 1877, 3 families from logging camps 40 miles north arrived to examine his construction methods firsthand. Eric spent 2 days explaining his integrated approach, emphasizing that no single technique provided the solution, but rather the combination of proper wood selection, moisture management, thermal mass heating, and flexible chinking created a building system that could withstand conditions that destroyed conventional construction. By 1878, 2 of the remaining settlement families had rebuilt their cabins using variations of Eric's methods. Thomas Henley adopted the moss chinking and extended roof design, while a new arrival named Jonas Eriksson constructed an entire cabin following Eric's integrated approach. The success of these second-generation applications proved that the methods could work beyond Eric's personal expertise and began establishing a regional building tradition. The transformation became complete when traveling craftsmen and lumber camp supervisors began recommending moss chinking and thermal mass construction to homesteaders throughout the Northern Territories. Within a decade, what had once been dismissed as Norske foolishness had become recognized frontier wisdom, passed down through informal networks of builders who understood that survival in harsh climates required techniques that worked with natural forces rather than against them. Eric's quiet rebellion against conventional frontier construction had evolved into a proven building system that would influence log construction practices throughout the northern wilderness for generations to come.